So today's lecture, we're going to be covering two authors, and if you wish, in some sense, representatives or illustrations of a tradition. And to some extent, that's kind of what we're trying to do, I think, in CVSP 202, is to look at expressions or different expressions of monotheistic thought, right? And this is now a movement towards looking at philosophy, or falsafa, or philosophia, take your pick, as one possible mode of expression within monotheistic thought, right? And the two authors we're going to be looking at, and I know you've already looked at that already with Ikhwan al-Safa, right? You've already done Al-Ghazali and Ikhwan al-Safa. But here we're looking at two self-proclaimed falasifa, or philosophers, from Al-Andalus, modern-day Spain. Those being Ibn Rushd, perhaps a very famous name. Any of you familiar with Ibn Rushd? Like, you know him? Yeah. Nice guy, yeah? Decent guy. Yeah? Ibn Maymun? No, هذا جديد علينا. Yeah? They're all Ibn someone, right? But they're also Abu someone. It's Abu Walid Ibn Rushd. So today we're going to be looking at these two authors as illustrations of, if you wish, this philosophical tradition, particularly in Andalus, right? But before we do so, I'm going to ask you to bear with me with a little digression, a little movement back in time. Because to start it off directly in Andalus, with Ibn Rushd particularly and Ibn Maymun, is to miss something, and that is that philosophy in the monotheistic context, in the Arab Islamic Judaic context here is how we're reading it, does not suddenly come out of nowhere in Spain, right? So very brief kind of recap, for me recap anyway, introduction to you perhaps, on the development of the philosophical mindset from its early days and years. Normally we say around 8th century, well 9th century AD, 2nd century Hijri in Baghdad particularly, right? So the aims of this lecture, as I have them set down on your fly sheet, is basically to introduce you to some of the basic elements of what we're referencing here in terms of the philosophical mindset or philosophy, but also to specify, to specifically look at these illustrations from the work of these two authors, Ibn Rushd and Ibn Maymun, on philosophy, and centrally on the role of philosophy in a monotheistic context, all right? So, it's always difficult to pinpoint and say, well, when does philosophy as a field, a particular kind of approach, arise, whether in Greece, ancient Greek times, or whether in the Arab Islamic tradition or the Christian tradition, Judaic. But the generally agreed upon, if you wish, date is to say, well, it's somewhere in 9th century, 800s, i.e. Baghdad somewhere, and what we then begin to refer to as the golden age of Baghdad, right? With Harun Rashid and then his children, Al-Ma'mun, Al-Mu'tasim. There was a heyday, really, a very phenomenal stage of studying and translation and interest in the study of philosophy. And please, when I say philosophy, we really literally mean here the Greek tradition of philosophy, philosophia, which then gets transliterated into Arabic as falsafa. These guys were interested in that heritage, right? Of course, it's definitely a Greek heritage, but it's also an Indo-Persian heritage, because even the Greek philosophers were already in contact and familiar with non-Greek elements from India, from Persia, from various places known to them at the time. So when we speak about the development of philosophy in the Arab Islamic world, or what we call the Islamicate, and then in Andalus at the hands of people like Ibn Tufayl or Ibn Rushd or Ibn Maymun, we're talking about a really long tradition, thousands of years. I mean, between Aristotle and Ibn Rushd, there you have about 1,400, 1,500 years, okay? So in Baghdad in the 800s and the 9th century, there was a heightened interest, what we call the translation movement, that was taking place. And it was a very interesting phase because it was taking place under the direct patronage and the support of the Caliphate, Al-Khulafa, right? It begins, many would say, already with Harun al-Rashid, but certainly with his successors, Al-Ma'mun and Al-Mu'tasim Billah, right? And when we talk about philosophy here, don't only think in terms of theoretical philosophy. This is how we normally associate it today. Philosophy really included all what you might call sciences now, right? Down to and including marine biology. This is a lovely illustration of some of the marine life they were studying at the time. Certainly astronomy, right? Which sometimes slips into astrology, but mostly it was astronomy. And the studying of the movement of the planets and the attributes and characteristics of these heavenly, what they called the heavenly bodies. And of course, mathematics, whether algebra or geometry, which they called hendasa, right? So engineering as well. And of course, natural sciences, and definitely metaphysics and philosophy, right? So when we say there was a heightened interest in the study of philosophy, we're not simply talking about, these kind of castles in the air philosophy. No, this is a field that really included all the possible sciences, al-ulum. And it's very interesting, in Baghdad at the time, they had a distinction between al-ulum al-qadima wal-ulum al-islamiyya, or the new ones. So you had the Muslim sciences and the ancient sciences. And by the ancient sciences, they meant all these sciences that they had received, studied, translated from these traditions, the Indo-Persian, the Greek, the etc., right? Which included, of course, mathematics, Pythagoras, for instance. It certainly included philosophy, Aristotle, Plato, and whatnot. And with the new sciences, or the Islamic sciences, they meant, ilm al-kalam, al-Ghazali's already talked to you a bit about that, and fiqh, jurisprudence, and various other things. Long story short, this was a thriving movement. And you get people like, very famous perhaps, Abu Yusuf al-Kindi, very well known to many as the first Arabic philosopher, and of course Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, maybe you're familiar with some of these names, Abu Bakr al-Razi. And as I said, this was directly supported by the ruling elite, right? At a certain moment, however, that tide shifted, because yes, there was a lot of support, but there was also a lot of tension, particularly with the ulama, particularly with what you call, generally called the theologians. And theology, or theologians, isn't a very accurate translation, but it works, it helps us. So there was certainly a conflict between those who were saying that, to fully understand and to fully engage in the life of faith and revelation, one needs the tools of philosophy, and between those who were saying, definitely not, right? Long story short. No, you do not use tools which are, first of all, pagan, from the pagan traditions and the polytheistic traditions of the Greeks or whatnot. And second, all you need is revelation. You don't need any other tools beyond revelation, right? Reason or philosophy. So the tide slowly started to change. And certainly the big movement begins with Al-Ghazali's teacher, right? Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari. Again, long story short. I keep saying that, it's going to be a long story. So Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, who was Al-Ghazali's teacher, is himself an ex-Mu'tazila, right? And the Mu'tazila were not philosophers in that sense. I mean, they're not a school of philosophy, they're a school of theology, ilm al-kalam. But they were very close to and akin, and, they liked the rational methods. And many scholars suggest they were very influenced by some of the early translations of the Greek works. So Al-Ash'ari comes from that tradition, but then he turns against it. He leaves Al-Mu'tazila and becomes one of their main opponents. And as you, of course, already know, Al-Ghazali becomes, well, their main opponent, as some would suggest. I don't know how fair it is to say that he was the end, and he is the all to blame. I don't think any one person can carry all the blame of the decline of Arab science and Arab Islamic science and philosophy, but certainly he is credited, if that's an interesting credit to get, right? So after the rise of the Shafi'i school, and then Al-Ghazali certainly and his students, you definitely find a decline in the exercise and the activities of philosophy and natural science in Baghdad, or what we call the eastern part of the Arab Islamic world. And mainly due to the fact that they lost the support of the caliphate that they had in the days of Al-Kindi certainly, and to some extent under Al-Farabi. So whereas Al-Muntasir Billah and Al-Ma'mun both were direct supporters of this development of the, we call the translation movements, the establishment of, Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, where we're told sometimes the Caliph himself would go and join in the discussions with the Falasifa. No, the tide certainly changes, and there's a kind of animosity to this tradition, of course, to the point that Al-Ghazali in his work, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, the deliverance from error, and some of his other works, associates kifr, right, unbelief, with philosophy, or at least with falasifa. We shouldn't say with philosophy. So that's in the Arab Eastern, or Arab Islamic Eastern part of the world. In the Western part, i.e. North Africa and Andalus, in Spain, a similar yet different story was unfolding. As the tide here in the eastern part was waning as far as philosophy is concerned, it was losing its support, losing interest and political support. In the North African and kind of southern Spain, Cordoba, there was a heightened interest, right? But again, of course, it'll go and come, depends who's ruler. So for instance, under one dynasty, there was a definite animosity to the falasifa and philosophical reasoning, as it was in Baghdad. But then under other rulers like Ahmed ibn Tumart, for instance, there was definitely direct support for the development of philosophy. To the point, actually, that Cordoba then started to compete with. It wanted to have an even more famous library than the one in Baghdad. Okay, so the one in Baghdad was, the House of Wisdom, Bayt al-Hikmah. Cordoba soon had its own Bayt al-Hikmah, and supposedly they got all these manuscripts also that were from Baghdad. It was an immense library, if you think about it in its own time. This is, 1,000 years ago or so. We're told they had about 400,000 manuscripts, mostly translated from Greek, from Persian. That's a pretty rich library. And then the rulers themselves were also very, very interested in these debates. And this is how we get, the star of someone like Ibn Rushd really shining, through being invited by one of the rulers at the time to write commentaries on Aristotle, to help him understand Aristotle, right? In fact, for instance, Abu Yusuf Yaqub, who was the governor of the time, one of the key figures in his court was Ibn Tufayl. Are you familiar with Ibn Tufayl, any of you? Right? You're familiar with Ibn Rushd, but not Ibn Tufayl, right? Yeah, lovely man. So Ibn Tufayl was actually, a common reference nowadays, perhaps, you have the scouts for football teams, right? They send out scouts and they look for new talent, right? Ibn Tufayl was a bit like that. He would literally seek new talent in philosophy and science and invite them to the court because they were, supported directly. They had the patronage of the ruling elite. And so that's how he recruited, so to speak, Ibn Rushd into the court at Cordoba. So that is just, to help you see the bigger picture that Ibn Rushd is writing in. When Ibn Rushd writes on philosophy and the place and role of philosophy, when Musa ibn Maymun is writing on philosophy, they're not coming out of a vacuum, right? They're coming out of, by their time, almost 400 years, 300 years of a tradition of intellectual debate, intellectual discussion, and intellectual conflict. A conflict which, on the one hand, there were those who were saying, we definitely need philosophy. Only through philosophy can you fully understand the faith. And on the other hand, those who were saying, you definitely do not need philosophy. And in fact, philosophy will lead you to unbelief, right? As you kind of encountered with Al-Ghazali. So when Ibn Rushd sets down quill and ink to paper and writes what he believes are the main arguments for philosophy and the importance of philosophy. And when Ibn Maymun is doing something like that, this is not just, here's what I think. They're responding to an environment. They're responding to a tradition and they're responding to a conflict. Okay? The fact that Ibn Rushd has to do this means there's the other school that's saying you do not need philosophy. And Ibn Rushd is saying, actually, I think we do. Right? And here's why. Okay? Likewise with Musa ibn Maymun. So keep that in mind, as these are two texts, two authors writing within a long tradition, which doesn't end with them. A lot of people say, Ibn Rushd is the end. He represents the end of Arab Islamic philosophy. I'm not sure anyone deserves such a morbid epithet. But definitely it doesn't end with him. I don't think philosophy ever ends. Some of you may say fortunately, some others may say unfortunately. So, with that in mind, all of this, nowadays, everything is ready at our fingertips, right? Facts and alternate facts, post-truth and truth and data. So you can find this, with any basic search you do online. Just so I don't focus much on biography, just some key points I want to share with you. Ibn Rushd comes from a line of prominent scholars and prominent jurists. His father before him and then he himself. Different perhaps than the tradition in his family, he was a great and phenomenal student of philosophy. He immersed himself in the study of philosophy, in the pursuit of particularly Aristotelian philosophy, translating, not himself, but overlooking translations, editing, commenting, explaining, right? And that's the quick anecdote I gave you earlier. Ibn Tufayl was at the time busy writing one of his most famous works, actually the only one that survives, Hay ibn Yaqdan. And the prince asked him if he could write something to help him understand Aristotle. And so Ibn Tufayl says, well, actually, I'm kind of busy. I'm in the middle of this great work that I think will survive forever. But I know someone who can help. I met this young man, really brilliant talent. Let me invite him. So Ibn Tufayl invites Ibn Rushd to the court, and he introduces him to the prince, and they get along splendidly. And he becomes actually the house physician, the doctor, right? So you see here what you have is a theologian, a jurist, a qadi. And when we say qadi, remember, this is not civic law, right? This is religious law, right? So he's a qadi shara, right? And a philosopher and a doctor, right? And this is what I meant earlier when I said, when you say philosophy, you really, you're looking at all of these, what we call nowadays a polymath or whatnot. But really, all of these natural philosophies, natural sciences were rolled into one. For whatever reason, at one point he fell from grace and he chose exile. Again, it was part of this conflict between the traditionalists or the ulama and the falasifa. Different stories why he fell from grace, but long story short is he fell from grace and he decided to leave Cordoba, and he went down to Marrakesh, where he died. Allah yarham. A couple of months later, the prince felt bad and they brought back his body and buried it in Cordoba, and there's a statue commemorating him, but he was dead, so he didn't get to see the honor. Musa ibn Maymun, also an Andalusian, they were definitely friends, they knew each other. Not sure about the influences or the crossovers, but they certainly were of the same tradition, the Aristotelian tradition. Very similar to Ibn Rushd, he had to choose exile at one point, and he left Andalus very much like Ibn Rushd did, but at a later stage where the tide really had turned against the rationalists. He went down to Egypt, where he became prince of his community, right? The Judaic communities have kind of princes and rabbis, right? So he was a big figure, a bit like Ibn Rushd being a Qadi Qudat, a chief judge. Ibn Maymun was also a high rabbi, if you wish, a rabbinic scholar, but also a doctor, and to none other than Salah ad-Din. He was actually Salah ad-Din's personal doctor and a philosopher, right? So again, in both of these characters, what you have almost is the very argument they're trying to present. The argument that religious faith, religious knowledge, philosophy, medicine, they definitely coexist. And they're in their own persons, they're almost personifications of that, right? They are both theologians, philosophers, doctors, jurists. One is a rabbi, another is a qadi, right? They're big references in their respective religious backgrounds. So their very own lives almost is a representation of what they're trying to argue. That not only can these two go together, the two being, the religious kind of approach and the philosophical approach, but they, as both say, must go together if you want the full grasp of religious truth and revelation and whatnot, okay? How do you put such an argument across is, of course, a different question. How do you put an argument across that the two, i.e. philosophy and revelation, are absolutely congruent and one is an accessory tool for the other, philosophy for revelation? So keep this in mind as we go now. I'm going to give you brief illustrations. Of course, you're going to have plenty of time to look at the details of the text. I don't want to go through all the text you're going to be reading. Just some illustrations of these basic principles that they're setting forth and how they're going to be dealing with them, right? The basic principle being that not only is it, as you'll see with Ibn Rushd, not only is it fine if we use certain doctrines or certain methods of philosophy, we actually have to do so if we hope to gain a proper understanding of revelation, right? So to that effect, Ibn Rushd wrote this phenomenal treatise, which I think you're reading in George Horani translation, which is translated on the harmony of philosophy and religion, right? But the full title, I think, even says it even more powerful. Apologies to anyone who's not fine with the Arabic, but I'll go into the English subtitles in a minute. But the Arabic says, this is Kitab Fasl al-Maqal wa Taqrir ma bayna al-Hikma wa al-Shari'a min ittisal. Right? Now that's usually translated into the decisive treatise determining the nature of the connection between philosophy and religion, or religion and philosophy. But no, the actual Arabic doesn't say falsafa wa deen or falsafa wa millah. It says hikmah wa sharia, right? Wisdom and religious law. That's his main concern in this treatise. Of course, that captures religion and philosophy, of course, right? But nowadays these terms have different meaning than what Ibn Rushd was speaking of. So it's very important to keep in mind his project. So this is a work in which he's going to determine the nature of the connection between philosophy and religion, or if you prefer, wisdom and religious law, al-hikmah wa sharia. More centrally, he's writing this work not as a philosopher. He's definitely an established philosopher, right? But he's not writing as a philosopher. He's writing as a Muslim. He's writing as a scholar of Islam, as a qadi. Because this is the approach that Ibn Rushd will take in this text. If, from an Islamic perspective, I can show, or someone can show me, that philosophy is forbidden, then done. End of discussion, khalas. We'll burn the books, we'll throw the books, whatever you want, right? But what he wants to show is from a Muslim or an Islamic grounding, as a jurist, as a qadi, he wants to show that philosophy is actually not only allowed, but actually commanded, right? And it's pretty difficult to argue with a qadi qudat, yeah? I mean, he's very well grounded. He knows what he's talking about, so to speak. Because I've had students in the past say, you know, his argument is false religiously. He's qadi qudat. I'm not saying he can't be wrong, right? He says that about Aristotle. Aristotle can't be wrong. I'm not saying Ibn Rushd can't be wrong. But it's a pretty powerful argument, right? He says of Aristotle, "Man kamila ma'ahu al-haqq." That's phenomenal. So what is the main line of the argument, or the main point that he wants to present here? Okay? This is an if, both in the hypothetical sense, but more centrally in the given, right? Given that, either is the Arabic uses, right? So if the activity of philosophy is nothing more than the study of existing beings and reflection upon them as indicators of the artisan, the creator, and if the law has encouraged and urged reflection on beings, then logical conclusion, yeah? Two premises conclusion. Then it is clear that what this name signifies, i.e. philosophy, is either obligatory or recommended by law. Okay? Is this clear? What he's trying to set out here? He says, look, it's a simple question we're debating. What is philosophy? Does the law command that which philosophy does? Therefore, the law commands philosophy. Done. Right? It's a very simple argument. Okay? So we need to break it down and say, if that's the activity of philosophy, if the law has encouraged this, then the conclusion follows. The first question concerns the second premise. If the law has commanded or encouraged and urged reflection on beings, religious law, has religious law encouraged and urged reflection on being? Yes? That's a very confident yes, like Ibn Rushd. Of course, he says. And how many references from the Quran do you want? Right? And he's willing to give you as many citations as you want. We'll suffice with 2. He says, here's a clear verse from the Quran. Reflect, you have vision. Right? This is God speaking. Yeah? Here's another one. The Lord says, have they not studied the kingdom of the heavens and the earth and whatever things God has created? Okay? As far as Ibn Rushd is concerned, the first one is fa'al amr, reflect. Right? The second one is encouragement. Have you not? Now, remember, as I said, he's a qadi, he's a jurist. Whenever you have 2 possible statements, one which is a command and one which is an encouragement, which is the higher one? The command. Right? Therefore, God, in his own words, in Revelation, commands us to reflect upon beings. Right? So far, so good, because this has nothing to do with philosophy. Not yet. But what is reflection? Says Ibn Rushd. Reflection is nothing more than inference and drawing out the unknown from the known. And since this is reasoning, or at any rate done by reasoning, therefore we are under an obligation to carry out our study of beings by intellectual reasoning. Right? If we are commanded to reflect, well, how do I reflect if not through reasoning? What does it mean to reflect, to think? Right? أَفَلَا يَتَفَكَّرُونَ أَفَلَا يَعْقَلُونَ. What does that mean? Do you use my reasoning? Right? Well, if I'm going to use my reasoning, either it is reasoning or it's done through reasoning, then if I'm being commanded to reflect, I'm essentially being commanded to use my reasoning. Great. Still, you may ask, شو خص الفلسفة? Right? Well, how do we reason? And according to Ibn Rushd, of course, since many others, but you're reading Ibn Rushd, there's different types of reasoning. One of them, for instance, is fallacious reasoning. Do you know what I mean by fallacious reasoning? False. Can we reason to wrong conclusions? Can we? That seems to me like that's all we've been doing in human history, right? You reason, you get to a conclusion, a couple of years later somebody says, oh no, wait, that was wrong, right? So reasoning in itself doesn't take you to truth. Certain forms of reasoning take you to truth, okay? So Ibn Rushd says, but if we're called upon to reason, then we're called upon also to learn the proper method of reasoning. The how to reason. What are the components of reasoning? What are the proper methods? What are the bad methods? Which forms of argumentation are valid? Which forms of argumentation are invalid? To do that, fortunately, I have those who have already done work in the field, not to mention Aristotle amongst others, right? So if I'm to learn the methods of reasoning, great, I will go to the books where I can learn the methods of reasoning. Those are the books of philosophy. Those are the books of the philosophers, right? But it's a very important point for Ibn Rushd. When I say go and learn the methods of reasoning, I'm not saying accept their conclusions. I'm saying learn the methods. Because I may study Aristotle's methods of reasoning, and mostly it's Aristotle, in the prior analytics, posterior analytics, a phenomenal amount of works he wrote on logic and reasoning, right? But if I say learn the methods of reasoning, says Ibn Rushd, I'm not saying accept his conclusions, because you might find that his conclusions were actually wrong based on his own methods of reasoning. Does that make sense? Yeah? So for instance, Al-Kindi, that's what he argues. Al-Kindi says, if I follow the method that Aristotle himself sets, I can prove that he was wrong in this conclusion. Right? So it's the method that counts. And this is an important point, because one of the objections that Ibn Rushd anticipated is that how are you calling upon us, or how are you suggesting that the law is commanding us to use methods of reasoning that are pre-monotheistic, pre-Islamic, set down by some weird pagans who used to go worship at the temple of Apollo or something. Right? How am I going to do that? And here he gives, again, you see his jurist, how he comes out. He gives a brilliant analogy, which really pay attention to this in the text. He says, that's a silly argument, because all I'm saying is you take the tool, not the conclusions, right? So what does that mean? He says, imagine it's time to give tadhiyah, a sacrifice, bil-adha. Okay? There's very clear ways on how one does that in accordance with Islamic Sharia and Islamic doctrine. Right? Suppose I don't have the knife, and I go to my neighbor and I borrow the knife from my neighbor. But my neighbor is not Muslim. Suppose he's a Jew. Suppose he's a pagan. Suppose he's a Buddhist. Right? I borrow the neighbor, sorry, not the neighbor, of course, I don't borrow the neighbor. That's another story. I borrow the knife, and I go and commit the sacrifice absolutely in accordance with the teachings and doctrines of Sharia. Is that a lawful sacrifice? Absolutely. Ibn Rushd says, it doesn't matter where I got the knife from. What matters is how I'm going to be using it. Right? Well, likewise, it doesn't matter where I'm getting these tools of philosophy from. Doesn't matter where they were written, in what language they were written. What matters is that I apply them and use them within the right context, right? Which is, as he says, the rules of Arabic language and the general kind of Islamic worldview, the doctrines, right? So I know, for instance, if I, according to Ibn Rushd, if I follow the methods of logical reasoning and I reach the conclusions that it is not possible to it is not possible that there is a God, then I know I've done something wrong with my reasoning, because my general principle says no. I mean, my reasoning should comply with these general. The details is a different question, as you'll see in your readings, but I'm not going to spoil that for you. Right? So long story short, and this is summarized on your fly sheet, the argument goes something like this then, right? So remember we said, if the activity of philosophy is nothing but the study of existing beings, and if the law has commanded that, then the law has commanded philosophy, right? So the law actually obliges us to study beings and reflect upon them, according to Ibn Rushd. Reflection is nothing but inference and drawing out things, and therefore I need reasoning. Therefore I need to study the principles and methods of reasoning. Therefore I need to study the books written on that subject matter, which are the books of philosophy, right? Now that I've studied that and gained the skill, now I go back to reflect upon beings, which is nothing more than philosophy. And therefore, the law commands, not allows, commands the study of philosophy, right? مأمور به على جهة الوجوب, he says, which is a scary thought for most of us in this room, I think. What, are you saying that if I want to fulfill my life as a believer, I need to go and study have to, I'm obliged to study philosophy. And Ibn Rushd says, yes and no. No, don't worry. Yes, but not for everyone, so don't worry. It is really a qualifying statement. The law commands the study of philosophy for those who can, right? Which for Ibn Rushd is exactly what the law commands for anyone. The law commands pilgrimage for those who can, right? The law commands fasting for those who can. The law commands the study of philosophy, reflection upon being, for those who can. And according to him, that's anyone who unites these two qualities. Natural intelligence, ذكاء الفطرة, right? Which is a whole topic we're not going to even go into now. And religious integrity and moral virtue, right? These are kind of, if you wish, qualities required of one to approach and study philosophy. The first one is the most important because as you'll see in your text, Ibn Rushd works from a premise that there are different intellectual capacities, right? That is not to say better and worse, azka or mish azka. No. Just simply different. In the sense that coming to tasdeeq, coming to assent in religious truths has three different ways. Either through the intellect, or through dialectical reasoning, jadaliya as he says, or through preaching, khutaba, right? And that's fine, so long as a person follows their natural capacity, that's fine. Again, I'm not going to go into too much details in your text. I'm sure you'll discuss it in your classes. But that's the main point for him, that the law commands the study of philosophy not for everyone, but for those who can. Exactly like the law commands whatever it commands for those who can. Right? So if I simply literally cannot go to pilgrimage, that's fine. Right? But if I can and I don't, that's not fine. Likewise, if I can study philosophy and I don't, according to Ibn Rushd, then I'm committing a mistake. Likewise, if I can and somebody stops me, hint al-Ghazali, right? Actually, at one point he mentions him, Abu Hamid. Yeah? Whoever forbids the study of them, i.e. the books of philosophy, to anyone who is fit to study them, is blocking people from the door by which the law summons them to the knowledge of God. Right? So he turns from defending philosophy to attacking those who attack philosophy. Right? Very clever. Good. The final note in the text, and so I'm jumping to the very end of your reading selection, because I think this is important to keep in mind. At the end of the day, the reason Ibn Rushd is writing this is because, as I said, there's a whole tradition that he's coming out from. Right? A tradition of animosity, a tradition of conflict. And he feels we need to insist on the importance of the place and role in philosophy in terms of helping us understand revelation. Right? So it's not philosophy for its own sake. It's not a standalone. Right? And so one of the closing parts of the work, I think, is most telling in that regard, where he says, our soul is in the utmost sorrow and pain by reason of the evil fancies and perverted beliefs which have infiltrated religion, and particularly such afflictions as have happened to it at the hands of people who claim an affinity to philosophy. Right? Some of the greatest damage done to religion, and according to Ibn Rushd's view, is by those who claim to be philosophers or close to philosophy. And he has some very central critiques against people like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, for instance. But I don't think he meant them particularly here, but in general, those who claim affinity to philosophy. Because injuries from people related to philosophy are the severest to religion, right? However, that's one side of the story. Now we have the other side of the story. Religion has also been hurt by a host of ignorant friends who claim an affinity with it. These are the sects which exist within it. So from Ibn Rushd's perspective, both sides, those who claim, to defend and be the champions of philosophy, have on occasion injured religion, and those who claim to be defending religion have also injured religion. And he feels that it is the role of someone like him to really help in alleviating this, not for the sake of defending philosophy, but in fact for the sake of defending religion. Right? Because if you follow through his argument, if truly philosophy or the tools of philosophy is what will help me fully understand revelation, then in defending philosophy, what I'm actually doing, I'm defending revelation or the proper understanding of revelation. Does that make sense? Hopefully at some level. Yeah. Along very similar lines comes Musa ibn Maymun and what he's trying to do in the Guide for the Perplexed. Right? Dalalat al-Ha'ireen. And the ha'ireen here is, of course, or the perplexed, is in reference to people of faith who have encountered reason and the strength of rational arguments and philosophy. And this is actually dedicated to one of his students. So this is from the introduction to the work, okay? So again, if you want to ask, well, what is Musa ibn Maymun trying to do in this work? Well, fortunately, he tells us. He says, my primary object in this work is to explain certain words occurring in the prophetic books and Revelation. It is not here intended to explain all these expressions to the unlettered or to mere tyros, novices. This is not meant for the public. This is not meant for the many. Keep this in mind again when you're reading Ibn Rushd. A previous knowledge of logic and natural philosophy being indispensable. So to truly understand certain verses, certain words, certain ideas in the books, the prophetic books, a knowledge of logic and natural philosophy is indispensable. Right? So, I'm not doing that to the unlettered or the tyros or to those who confine their attention to the study of our holy law. I mean the study of the canonical law alone. For the true knowledge of the Torah is the special aim of this and similar work. The true knowledge. Right? Great. How are you going to do that? The object of this treatise is to enlighten a religious man. So that's our premise. Right? We're not looking for someone and to convert them. This is someone already a man of religion. Okay? Likewise with Ibn Rushd, likewise with Al-Ghazali. Good? So it's to enlighten a religious man who has been trained to believe in the truth of our holy law, who conscientiously fulfills his moral and religious duties, and at the same time he has been successful in his philosophical studies. Human reason, says Ibn Maymun, has attracted him to abide within its sphere, so this person has become rational, and he finds it difficult to accept as correct the teaching based on the literal interpretation of the law, and especially that which he himself or others derive from those homonyms, metaphors, etc. Right? I'm going to skip the next one. It's you get the general gist of it, right? So the basic idea is that what he's proposing here is, like I said, this is a work dedicated to his student who has become very successful in the study of philosophy, but the rational truths are causing him a bit of perplexity when it comes to the text, because he's been told, as many of us have been told, that you take these words literally, right? So that God looked upon, and you take all of this literally. But this person, as Ibn Rushd also tells us, when you're looking at the philosophical, the rational grounding, something tells you can't take this literally. But if I can't take it literally, what do I do with it? Well, you interpret it. Well, how do I interpret it? Right? What kind of interpretation? What method for interpretation? And who is doing the interpretation? As you saw, Ibn Maymun has already told us, this isn't for the unlettered, this isn't for the novices, and this isn't for those who are just following canonical law. Right? This is a particular type of student. So these are the parts of the work. It's a very comprehensive work. As you'll see, you're reading parts from, selections from work part 1. All of this will be on the website, I think, at one point, so you can refer to it. But basically, what Ibn Maymun wants to work on is a question of understanding the divine, right? Particularly in the selections you're reading. What is God? Right? Remember Augustine? What then do I love when I love God? Do you remember? You still remember that? Good. What then is the God I worship? Right? It's a question of trying to understand the divine and the qualities of the divine. And this is a discussion that's been going on in the time of Ibn Kindi, Ibn Rushd. What do I do with the 99 names of God? Are these names? Are these attributes? Are these, right? There's a similar debate going on with Ibn Maymun and his circle, because there's also a number of references which are taken to be, if you wish, like Asma Allah, the names of God in the Torah. And again, what do we do with this? Right? He is Rahim. What does that mean? He is loving, he is wrathful, he is, right? So he's trying to make sense of this, and he begins with philosophy. He says, to understand anything, we need to define it. Okay? And here what we're talking about is a simple unity, a one, a God, which is the basis of monotheism, right? So he says there cannot be any belief in the unity of God except by admitting that he is simple substance. Just to be clear, simple here means not made of parts, right? God is not compound. God is simple unity. But if that is your premise, you'll see what follows from there. If we accept that God, and this is a premise of monotheism, if you accept that God is simple unity, then the ways of defining things philosophically don't apply to God, as you will see. Right? So for instance, He says, every description of an object by affirmative attribute, definition, etc., we want to see which of the 5 ways of definition apply, if any, to God. Again, quick illustrations, and then I'll leave the rest for you in class. The first mode of definition which you can use is description by definition, i.e. explanation of a name containing the true essence of the object. So for instance, a triangle is a polygon whose interior, sum of interior angles is 180 degrees, right? That's the essence of a triangle, right? That's definition. Try to formulate something like that about God. God is, okay? If you have an answer, don't say it out loud. Go write it, publish it. This is really difficult. God is what? By definition, right? And again, according to Ibn Maimon, this is not possible to speak about God in that manner. For a simple reason. The moment I say X is Y, whatever X is, whatever Y is, Y must pre-exist X. Does that make sense? The chair you're sitting on is blue. If blueness didn't pre-exist the chair wouldn't have the attribute blue. Yeah? Sorry to spoil it. Yeah? So if God is X, what am I kind of saying? I'm saying X kind of pre-exists God, and God takes on the attribute, etc. Right? So it's a problematic. Again, I'm not going to go into the details. The second one, you can define something by part of its definition. Right? The human is a rational, mortal, social, weird animal. Right? You take part. You say, well, the rationality part, or the humanity part, or the animality part. Okay? Again, we've started out by saying God is simple unity, so obviously I cannot say God is merciful as in that's a part of God. Right? Or God is omnipresent as if that's one component of God. That's not possible. A third way of definition is to describe something by quality. Right? And these are Aristotelian concepts, so pay attention to them. If something, you can say about someone they're shy, right? They're extroverts. They're here, they're not here. They're tall, they're short, so size, quality, etc. Can you imagine using these terms about God? Right? God is Nehai, what? But we do, that's the thing. We do, we say God is wrathful. That sounds like a human quality, right? God is caring, okay? So that's Ibn Maimun's point, is that if you think about this, none of these words really apply. Of course, we use them, but now I think he says it's our point and endeavor to bring to light what we mean when we use them. And for that, I need philosophy. And I'll close with this quick, sorry. Where'd it go? There. Right? In short, in brief, it is necessary to demonstrate by proof that nothing can be predicated of God that implies any of the following things. Corporeality, God is not corporeal, it's not physical. Emotion or change, God doesn't change, God is not emotive. Or existence, non-existence. Right? In this respect, our knowledge of God is aided by the study of natural science, i.e. philosophy. For he who is ignorant of the latter, i.e. natural science, cannot understand the defect implied in speaking about emotions and difference between potentiality and actuality and whatnot. He who knows these things, but without their proofs, does not know the details which logically result from these general principles, and therefore he cannot prove that God exists, or that the 4 things mentioned above are inadmissible in reference to God. In other words, I cannot fully understand God, or even know or prove that God exists, without the tools provided to me by logic, by natural philosophy and natural reasoning. Right? This is the main line that both Ibn Rushd and Ibn Maimun are taking, not for the sake of philosophy, but for the sake of revelation. Good? Fantastic. So that's it. I'm done. Thank you. I just need you to stay